Hello buddy, it's Wyvern again. Yes, I know it's a bit of a content heavy day, but there's a lot I had to put up. So yeah, this is going to be another video, and we are actually going to be covering the stat changes that are being implemented in multiplayer, specifically with the Twisted and Twilight update. So obviously, there have been some major changes to battle mechanics. Most importantly, the knockback chances have been altered significantly. Now, previously, you had checks for knockdown happening every couple milliseconds, every fraction of a second, every couple fractions of a second. You'd have multiple checks happening to see if a unit got knocked down, and this resulted in some units getting knocked down much more than they should have been, despite whatever their mass may have been. It helped contribute to the continuously getting punted all over the place foot lords and foot characters and that sort of thing, and that's actually been revised now. Now I do believe there's a 2-second check in between characters, or in between characters colliding. So if say a Shaggoth collides with a State Trooper, you now have 2 seconds before that State Trooper takes a knockdown check again. So potentially that State Trooper will in fact stay standing, or normally he would have just been sent flying because there's so many checks happening. This does mean that these mass changes, they have been kind of hyped up a lot, I think, by a lot of content creators over the last 2 weeks. This does mean, in my opinion, that they won't be as impactful against certain units as they are against others. For example, against cavalry, where you often have multiple entities smashing into a lot of entities at once, I think it means that you won't necessarily see that much impact, because when you have so many checks going on at once, odds are a lot of units will be sent flying regardless. A lot of units will be disrupted, and it's going to be a pretty disruptive charge. However, it does mean that single entities especially, and I think lower model count entities like chariots, will have a much harder time pushing through, because there's only, say, 3 chariots, and there's only so much surface area they're making contact on. And if they happen to fail their knockdown checks, then those units will just stay standing and block them. So obviously it's interesting, and a lot of these changes, I think, that are being implemented kind of reflect the expected impact of this knockdown check being reworked. So without further ado, let's dive in. It's definitely a bit of a lengthy patch, as tends to be the case, and I do think there's some interesting stuff in here, as well as some kind of disappointing stuff. So diving right in with the Beastmen, only 2 changes here. The Beast Lord Razor Gore Chariot has gone up in HP, as has Khazrak One Eye's Razor Gore Chariot. There have also been some changes to abilities, and we'll get to those later. But a little bit more HP for these characters is not the biggest thing ever. Now, do keep in mind, Khazrak's HP increase, and keep in mind, this is also on Ultra setting, so when you see an extra 240 HP, it's actually 180 on Large, which most of us are probably playing on, especially if you're in multiplayer. That's what you're playing on. So do keep that in mind. But keep in mind, it also will synergize with the reworked Dark Mail that Khazrak is getting. So it means that you get an extra 20, and that's an extra 20% ward save when in melee. So you get an extra bit of HP on top of that, which is pretty nuts. You also do have an increased max splash attacks, which should reduce overkill, especially against infantry, and should make Khazrak an even bigger menace when it comes to crushing infantry formations. Especially combined with the reworked Scourge, this is probably going to make Khazrak kind of nasty at just being an infantry lawnmower. Though I don't necessarily think it's going to make him sort of insanely powerful. I don't think these raw stat changes here are necessarily going to be like game changing. I do think combined, especially for Khazrak, who's getting some new or reworked kit, I think these changes could have quite meaningful impact for the Beastmen, or for making Khazrak a more viable Lord choice. Otherwise, though, I will say I'm a little disappointed right off the bat, and I will try to sort of touch on the what I think are like some downsides, or lack of, or missed points, as well as upsides as I go through here. But I do think the fact that there's very little Beastmen change here is, I think, a little bit of a mistake. There are some small tweaks that could have been implemented for sure to Beastmen. For example, I do think some of the Ungors could be a little cheaper. They're just very, very pricey for some pretty bad combat stats. They're some of the worst units in the game when it comes to their combat stats, and they're kind of pricey for those stats to boot. So perhaps I think Ungors could have gone down in price a little bit. I think Ungor Raiders could have perhaps gotten a little bit more range, make them a little more competitive at zoning away enemy skirmish cav especially, and pressuring skirmishers a little bit more effectively. I think there could have been some slight tweaks made in that sense. Maybe a little more leadership for Bestigors to make them a slightly better anchor unit. I think some slight tweaks could have been made, and they just didn't get done. We're seeing very little changes here for the Beastmen. Moving on to Britonia, there are some pretty nice changes here, as well as some kind of meh ones. First and foremost, the Barded Warhorse character mounts got a massive buff to mass, which I think is nice. This should make them a little bit more capable of pulling through, though obviously this is competing against the reworked knockdown check, so it does mean they're probably not going to pull through much, if any, better. It might actually still be worse, but at least it should allow these characters, on paper, that should mean these characters have a little bit more capability to pull through formations. Horse characters were never particularly good at pulling through formations, so I can imagine this wouldn't be the most deleterious change. Going through further, we do have men-at-arms and polearms who are dropping in cost down to 450. That is a pretty hefty buff. This was kind of an underperforming unit for their cost, especially if you compare them to like Eternal Guard. And if you still compare them to Eternal Guard, they're a terrible unit. And obviously, this is because Britonia is kind of a crap infantry roster. It's to be expected. But there's crap, and then there's super crap, which is kind of what the men-at-arms were for a long time. And I do like the fact that they've gotten down in price a little bit. I was a little worried it might be a bit underpriced, but I do think the pricing is probably fair. And I think it should make men-at-arms and polearms a little bit more viable, especially with the changes to mass. They should be able to hold much more efficiently and just be a much better stalling force. And with their AP, they can obviously put the hurt on units now. Foot Squires, next up, did get some mild buffs. They did go up in cost to 700, so went up back up to 700. Got melee defense up to 26, and melee attack up to melee defense up to 24, melee attack up to 26, which is okay. It's nothing to write home about, but it is okay. And their charge bonus did drop to 18. This does mean that they will be much less efficient in sustained in short-term combat, in a short-term burst. They will be hitting a little less hard. They've got 4 less weapon strength on the charge and 3 less melee attack. But it means in sustained combat, they should perform much, much more efficiently. And I do believe this was a highlight in the recent Everchosen, in Britonia versus Dwarves. These guys did perform a bit better. I still don't think they're going to be an optimal unit most of the time. Their stats are still bad, let's be honest here. 26, 24, even with the bonus versus infantry thrown in, it's going to be like 35. It's not very good. But at least they should be a little more resilient and not bleed HP as heavily as they do right now. Mounted Yeoman got some slight tweaks, more charge bonus, more leadership, and most importantly, increased weapon strength, an extra 4 combined weapon strength, of which 50% of that boost is AP. So going up to 6 AP I think is huge. Mounted Yeoman are still not going to be an excellent choice. Knights Errant are just so good that they're always, I think, going to outpace these guys a bit, but I think this is a good change. Mounted Yeoman Archer is getting a slight tweak up in HP. Seems kind of pathetic. It's kind of meh, but it's not a bad change. I'm not going to complain there. Damsel got some charge bonus changes, slightly reduced. Nothing huge there. Unicorns got massive reworks overall. Their charge bonus went up to 50. The melee defense, you can see, went up quite a bit. Changes to mass, though. The mass did go down, so that is a little bit of a downside. Well, it all should make unicorns a bit more of a slugger and a little bit tankier. Could definitely incentivize using them a bit more. Fanchantress actually took nerfs to her foot state, which I think is fair, but surprisingly no nerfs on Silvaron. I think this is a slight mistake. Now, personally, I think Fanchantress' melee stats aren't necessarily what needs to be nerfed. I think the main nerf focus should be on supporting characters, like Paladins especially, like Guardian, and such a dirt cheap anti-large character is kind of ridiculous. But I think Mist of the Lady, for example, could have been removed when she's retreating. It could be deactivated when she's routing. So the fact that I don't believe this has changed down in abilities, I think is a downside. All she got some mild stat tweaks here. Could have had some changes to her resistances, could have lost her missile resist perhaps, or something along those lines. Because keep in mind, she gets both physical and magic resist already, so she's a very tanky lord, as is. Some small changes like that could have happened, and they didn't happen here, which is kind of a mistake, I think. Companions of Canel, plus 50 cost. This is like the bare minimum, honestly. These guys are insanely good for their cost. They're honestly, if they were on any other roster, this would easily be a 1700 to 1800 gold cav. No questions asked. It's an insanely good regiment right now. People are already complaining that they're gonna be useless compared to Questing Knights now. That would be because Questing Knights are broke OP too, and I hate to break it to you, Brett fans. I love Bretts, but they're my second most played faction. They're one of my main, when I actually do play tournaments, they're one of my main go-to factions. But that's because Questing Knights are insanely overpowered too. And actually, that's one of the things I think is a mistake here, is the fact that this patch isn't nerfing Questing Knights. We're not seeing any nerfs to Pox Arrows. We're not seeing any nerfs to Poison overall. So there's no nerf to Pox Arrows at all. There's no nerf to Questing Knights, which are probably 200 gold underpriced cavalry. And even when you account for the fact that the Brett roster is Cav-centric, I think they could go up by 50 to 100 gold. Or have nerfs to their stats somewhere. And peasant mobs are not getting any nerfs. So I think that is definitely a downside here to the Britonian side of things. Like, yeah, there's a lot of buffs, which is nice, and a lot of these units were in a bad spot, or might still be in a bad spot, might still need a little more tweaking. But the fact that there's very little nerfing here, I think is a mistake. Britonians are currently a rather strong faction already, but they're very much on the backs of some very overtuned units who need a hammering from the nerf bat, and the fact that it's not happening is a little flustering, in my mind at least. Moving on to Dark Elves, who have definitely been a bit of a rough patch lately. Changes are kind of limited. I should mention, there's a lot of single entities that have gotten a boost to melee attack and a drop to melee defense. This is just an across-the-board change CA seems to be implementing, trying to make single entities, the big ones, a little less tanky, but a little more damaging. Just moving more towards a offensive meta, I should say. Just how this works out, I'm not sure. I don't know if it is going to make a huge difference. I feel like it won't, but it is just something that you're going to see all over the place with this patch notes. Regardless, Loki has gotten some changes to his mobility. More importantly, some changes to his offensive stats and to his defensive stats. He should now be a much more survivable lord, with it, and definitely a bit improved against infantry, especially with an improved splash attack. Malice Darkblade has also received a buff. He has gone up, so his demon form now doesn't damage him for anywhere nearly as much. Before, he would take 45 damage randomly with a 50% chance to take it per tick. So now it's 9 damage every tick, and it's guaranteed damage. So now, where before you'd take 45 damage, so you'd average out to 22.5. You'd average out to 22.5 damage taken per every tick. You're now going to be averaging. You obviously are going to average 9 damage per tick, but it's a significant reduction in the amount of damage you're taking, and especially when you consider his healing in melee, it should mean that as long as you keep Malice in melee form, then he's basically barely affected by the demon form's HP drain, as long as you're able to stay in melee. Some changes to Cold on Mass, which is nice. Hopefully offsets any downsides changed by the knockdown nerfs. Crone Hellebron now causes fear. Hip hip hooray. Slightly better combat stats. Yay. There really isn't much to be said here. A little bit more melee attack, and more importantly, massive boost to weapon damage on the Cauldron of Blood should definitely make her a bit more damaging. Same thing for the Death Hag, much more AP component on the Cauldron, so hopefully now it's much more of an infantry grinder than it was before. I definitely do like these changes made to the Cauldron of Blood. I do think it's a nice shift there. Besides that, continued mass changes for the horse characters, just kind of the name of the game. Changes for dragons. Not really going to spend too much time on those. And some changes to weapon length as well. I do believe these are partially to offset especially in aerial combat, you'll often have units missing attacks against their opponent due to some janky animations. And I do believe the weapon length is to offset that a bit. So we do see the weapon length thing was changed. Big changes to Cold, and this is where we get into units, and I think this is where the first major changes outside of Malice and to lesser extent Loki come in. Cold One Dread Knights. Melee attack was upped, their HP is way higher, and they did go up in cost to 1300. So I think this is actually a huge buff to them. They're now just shy of, I think, 5000 HP overall as a unit, which is really nice. It Still means they bleed Malice of Spirit Leech, which is not as good, but it does mean they're much more forgiving, especially for a faction that doesn't have healing. It means they should be much more capable of taking attrition, and if they, for example, take a nasty charge from a unit like Knights of the Blazing Sun, they can ride it out a little bit better than they could before. So definitely a nice buff to see, in my opinion. Bleak Swords did get a buff to stats across the board. I'm personally not a huge fan of it. Now, I do understand that Bleak Swords, the way their HP pool works out, they get killed an entire hit faster than Empire Swordsman, for example, which is one of those things you don't really notice. You might see that the HP difference is only a handful of points, but in practice, it means that on average, a Bleak Sword will die an entire hit from an Orc Boy or an entire hit from a Goblin or Empire Swordsman faster than the Empire Swordsman does. So that is something to keep in mind. And so Bleak Swords did kind of underperform. Their stats were roughly on par with Empire State Troops when it came to sustained melee. They had better melee attack, lower melee defense. Silver Shields, of course, and better leadership and more murderous prowess, but they didn't really get much value, especially on murderous prowess. And the leadership was still not that good. And the Silver Shields were nice, obviously, but that was just kind of one thing. Now they should be a little more better performing in melee. And while I'm not necessarily convinced it's fair to give it to them for free, I do hope that it makes Bleak Swords a little more viable or useful. Dark Shards, slightly improved accuracy. Normal Dark Shards were made slightly cheaper. Leadership was also improved on these units, so hopefully that does improve them. Personally, I'm not entirely sure it's going to fix Dark Shards' problem. One of the big problems for Dark Elves is just defending their backline, and the fact that Dark Shards kind of struggle to hit due to low projectile velocity, but hopefully this helps them a bit. I might actually be doing a Fixing the Forgotten video at some point on Dark Elves, and I do think that Dark Shards could perhaps use a complete overhaul at this point to try to help Dark Elves a bit in some of their troubled matchups. But I do think the unit is... I don't mind these changes. I just don't necessarily think they're going to fix what the problem is for Dark Shards at the moment, which is just their unreliability. Blackheart Corsairs, slightly more charge bonus, which is nice. Blackheart Corsairs with hand bows, big buff to melee defense. Once again, rather nice. And Dread Spears, good buff to stats. So what we're seeing is a lot of the cheaper Dark Elf troops get massive buffs, and I think it should make wide Dark Elf builds a bit more viable, should make wide Dark Elf builds a bit more rewarding. And I think all in all, it's definitely a solid spate of buffs. I would have liked to see Scourge Runner nerfs and honestly Light Chariot nerfs in general to armor, even if this did come at a cost buff. But one of the things that's been irking me for a while now is that Light Chariots have insanely good armor. And they've had so since the Shadow and the Blade was released. And I really do wish that instead they would simply have like 50 armor, even if it meant they were cheaper. But that does not seem to be CA's intent here. No reworks or changes were made to Scourge Runners or any other chariots. So unfortunate, but is what it is. I do, however, hope that all these buffs to the cheap trash troops should make Dark Elves a little more competitive. They do have a lot of struggling matchups right now. They're kind of a struggle street. The low HP and short range nature of the faction just doubles into a kind of difficult proposition for them in matchups against factions like Greenskins, or who can just shock through them very quickly. Moving into the Stunties, who are probably the biggest winners of this patch due to the fact that the mass changes or the knockdown changes were so immense. We've got Ironbreaker changes, nerfs to melee defense, also nerfs to their missile damage, and nerfs to the Regiment of Renown, which has gone up in cost. So should hopefully make them a little easier to hit. Previously, their insane melee defense just made it practically impossible for some units to deal with Ironbreakers. So hopefully the melee defense nerf does help there a little bit. They do still cost the same, the normal variant at least. The Regiment Round is more expensive, so hopefully this does kind of remove their almost auto-include status in some builds or in some play styles. But I think they're fair nerfs. I don't think Ironbreakers were necessarily the most broke OP, but they had some, when used in specific niches, they're just a very oppressive infantry unit for certain factions to deal with. So I think it's fair to bring them down a notch. Papa Gromby is now unbreakable. He does also cost more, has way more HP, and has much better melee defense. So just all in all, straight buffed. Should be well worth his cost, I think. Keep in mind he's going to get knocked over a lot less, which is really nice as well. Same thing with Ungrim. Big buffs to weapon strength, buffs to his survivability, and so once again, we're going to be seeing some buffs there. to some of these characters. Giant Slayers actually went down in certain stats, but they did get more HP, and they did get more damage output, so they will be hitting a bit harder. And obviously, once again, keep in mind, knockdown changes are going to be big, in my opinion, for some of these units. And a unit like Giant Slayers or Ungrim, the fact that on top of stat buffs, they're going to not knock over as much, it's going to make them rather powerful, especially if it's like a box that you're fighting in. Like if you're fighting in a box formation, they're going to be very hard to dislodge. So I actually could see them being very, very potent there. Miners did get a nerf to their blasting charges. Hopefully makes them a little less brutal to squishy troops. Though I do kind of wish Miners would just get an overhaul and get bumped up a tier, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to be happening. And other great weapons also got a big boost to charge bonus, including Longbeards, including Peak Gate Guard and Hammerers. So I don't mind that. I think it's nice. I do think that Dwarf Great Weapons should be more viable and more encouraged. So I think the fact that they're going up in charge bonus, which was a tabletop gimmick for them, was that they had very good charge bonus. Or that they hit better or hit harder on the charge. So I think this is a good representation of that. Moving on to artillery and weapon crews, leadership has dropped across the board by 2, basically. The sole exceptions, I believe, if I can find them, there was actually buffs to grudge thrower with damage output, but there were actually a massive nerf to bolt throwers who went down in leadership from 75 to 64. Now, I don't honestly mind the downward tweak in leadership here. What irks me is that, and this is already a trend that happened going into Warhammer 2, is that leadership, there was a leadership power creep essentially going. Now, granted, High Elves, Dark Elves, Lizards, they all pay for the better leadership, so it's not like they're overpowered. But their leadership is a lot higher than it should be relative to dwarves, especially. But it's egregious even compared to some other factions and some other, when you look at what their tabletop and stats were and what their leadership was there. But especially the dwarves, the fact that dwarvish leadership is just going to be worse than elf leadership. Keep in mind, high elf artillery crews have 75 leadership. Dark elf ones, I believe, have 70, or they've got better leadership than dwarf crews. I find that completely preposterous. I think it's ridiculous. None of the elf factions are supposed to have leadership on par with dwarves on average. They just aren't. So this weird shift to nerf dwarven leadership is, I understand from balance perspective why, but it just irks me that we're going to nerf all the dwarf artillery crews and there's no nerfs to elves. Artillery crews. Even if this game was some cost adjustments, I don't honestly mind that, but I just find it a bit ridiculous that elf artillery crews have way more leadership than dwarven ones do, when it's completely the opposite in tabletop. Like, dwarves are the stubborn bastards who just don't retreat, even the artillery crews. So I don't know, it just irks me a bit. Spoiler for the high elf changes ahead, but yeah, their bolt throwers didn't get changed this way because #elfed. Nah, I don't mind that, but no, it is one of those little things that kind of irks me a bit, even if it's not necessarily a balancing issue. Moving on to Empire, halberdiers went down in price immensely, just like the polearms. Charge defense versus large has replaced charge defense versus all, so they're much less effective versus infantry, but much cheaper. So I think they'll be a better holding force. I still don't think you're going to see them very much. They're just so easy to pincushion. They're so squishy. Still so expensive for just cannon fodder that you need to zone with. I don't think you're going to see halberds much at all, but maybe it'll be making them a little more viable. So improved mass once again. Blah, 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 blah. Slightly better splash on Karl Franz Pegasus here. By and large, there isn't much to say. Empire is in a pretty sweet spot right now. I think the steam tank still needs looking at, like just being overhauled entirely. I think Karl should lose the dual wield, and maybe Volkmar should get some slight nerfs. There's some slight tweaks here and there I'd encourage for Empire, but by and large, the roster is in an excellent spot. I'm not surprised there isn't much happening here. So, yeah, Empire is almost the same. There's a major overhaul. There's a handful of units that I would like to see massively overhauled, but from a small-scale balancing perspective, I don't think any of them are in a bad spot, really. I completely understand this and think it's pretty fair. For greenskins, AP loonies have gone up in cost. That was to be expected. I think it's actually might not even be enough in cost, but you know, it's decent. Go 700. Crimson Killers, cheaper, so hopefully you see them a little more often. Though I think that might be a bit undeserved, especially 100. Maybe 50 would have been smarter, but they're definitely a rare unit to see. So that's kind of true for all elite grade weapons. Blackrock Big Boss is much more expensive now. He also doesn't have a silver shield on the boar anymore, which is kind of sad. And Grom does have longer weapon length. As you can see, this should allow him to engage foes in front of his chariot a bit better. Because previously that was an issue. He just couldn't engage. Stone Trolls went down in missile resist, which I think is fair. It's not good. They're still going to be resistant to missiles, but a little less so than before. So all in all, I think a fair change. The big problem right now with Orcs is that they just have so much insane internal synergy. That it's not so much that individual units are overpowered for most part, it's that the unit's synergy is overpowered. So I think with some slight price nerfs that we're seeing here, and with some slight HP nerfs to force goblins and slight missile resistance nerfs, I think all these tiny tweaks should add up to make the Orcs a bit more manageable. So there's HP changes to force goblins. I think Spider Riders, I think that's a good change for sure. Slight melee attack buff to River Trolls, definitely nice. Wolf Rider Archers, a little more expensive, nice. My main critique right now here is that Orc Boar Boy Big Guns were completely ignored in this patch, and quite frankly, Orc Boar Boy Big Guns are overpowered for what they cost. They used to be a pretty well balanced unit, but they had terrible support, so that made Orc Cavalry very hard to use. And so I didn't mind it when they initially got armor buffs, because they didn't have good support still, so at least they could operate a little more independently. But now they have insane support, and they have insane combat performance for how cheap they are. And that has made them an insanely difficult cavalry to deal with for some factions, and it makes them very frustrating to try to play against. And I think that the armor buff should have been rolled back on Boar Boy Big Guns this patch. So the fact that it didn't happen disappoints me. Lariel got some minor nerfs to her melee defense. Also, across the board nerfs for Eagles and Phoenixes. They are now easier to hit. Their entity radius, which means I believe how big the hitbox is, has been increased on all these units by 0.2, which is a significant nerf in my opinion. I think I'm not entirely sure how the hitboxes are designed in Total War. If it's a sphere or if it's a or if it's an elliptical shape, or what is exactly, if it's how exactly they're designed. But whatever the case may be, this should be a tangible nerf. Also nerfs to HP on Arcane Phoenixes, and Techless's Arcane Phoenix lost his missile resist, so definitely nice to see there. Noble Chariot went up in cost, though the Eagle did not go down in cost, which I think is a little unfortunate. Or didn't go down in cost by as much, which I think should probably be cheaper. It's not a very good mount. The Omen of Asturnian also didn't get a buff, which I think is a mistake. I think that's a bad Regiment of Renown. It could have gone up in price or up in value somehow. Some buffs could have been seen there. But yeah, all Phoenix got a nerf. Of course, all the single entities got more melee attack and less melee defense. Blah, 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 blah. We all know that. And as I mentioned before, I'm not entirely sure how much of a practical difference it's going to make. Eltharion the Grim, smidge boost to melee attack, which I think is terrible. He should be much cheaper. Just kind of bad. And Tyrion got slightly better splash attacks, but really I think both of these could have used slightly better buffs there, especially Eltharion could just use bigger buffs. For Lizardmen, the Bastillodon with the Solar Engine got slight accuracy nerf, though I think it could have used a hefty price nerf too. Nakai got a mild buff to pretend he got a buff. He still is not good in my opinion. Tic-Tac-Toe had an across-the-board buff, better charge bonus, better weapon length, better speed. So all in all, I think he's going to be a much, much stronger character. Fly speed going up to 11, which I don't know why there's no 0 at the end here, but it should be to 110. It means he's going to be much more mobile and much more capable of escaping. And his Sphere of Teapot will now do more damage, which is also nice. Krokar is going to be a bit cheaper, which is nifty as well. He's definitely gone down in value over time, so I think that's fair. Pterodons all got buffs to their weapon length, which is really nifty. Unfortunately, no practical buffs to Fireleech Bola, so I'm kind of disappointed there. And no real buffs to Kroxigor to the Croxcore Regiment Round, which is kind of disappointing. Or a little cheaper on the Regiment Round, but Ancient Croxcore still, or Sacred Croxcore still suck for the cost. I think they could use a mild cost buff or stat buff somewhere. Lord Croak got cheaper. I think that'll make it much more viable. And then Sword Spear's got a pretty hefty buff. More bonus versus large, more AP, though at the cost of non-AP, so nice changes there. I still don't think it's going to make them super popular, but hopefully a little bit more than they are now. I think these guys need a heftier boost to their anti-large to make them a real choice. But as of now, I still think normal stars will be better. And Reprodactyls are now a bit beefier. Not by a huge amount, 28 more HP per entity. Obviously, with just 8 models, that's not going to add up to a whole lot. That's 224, I believe, HP extra. It's okay. You know, it's not bad. It's something, but there's not going to be like some beefcakes anyway, but a little tankier. So all in all, I think the lizard changes are pretty fair. I think there could have been heftier nerfs made to the Solar Engine. I think there could have been heftier buffs to spears and the Arc of Sotek, and I think there could have been more serious buffs to Fire Leech Bolas, but by and large, I think, and of course, Nakai could have gotten much bigger buffs. Same with 10 and 1, but by and large, I think it's reasonable, mild changes. Norska mostly changes to splash attacks on ice trolls. Some changes to knock ignore chance being reworked, which previously this was being used to offset the poor stagger effects. Of course, the Manticore has better weapon distance, but and Marauders with Grey Weapons are now a smidge cheaper, which is kind of nice. Should make them a smidge more viable, but really, once again, pretty mild changes here. Nothing to write home about, in my opinion. Across the board nerfs for Skaven Slaves, and before someone freaks out, Skaven Slaves are kind of or thinks it's kind of laughable. Skaven Slaves are definitely overtuned for how cheap they are, especially when you factor in their strength in numbers. It's just very difficult to drop it on such a cheap unit. You don't want to waste shots on them. So, yeah, Skaven Slave Spears going down is definitely going to be nifty, in my opinion, and should help them be a little more manageable, I would think, even if not by a huge amount. The Warlord got some buff to HP there, and once again, we're seeing character mass being changed, but Bonebreaker buffs, definitely nice. Look at that. A little bit of lag there. But and he's a bit cheaper too, so Bonebreaker change will be nice. Of course, he now also has the Brood Horror option, so that's also nifty. Queek's got slightly better stats. Eshin Decoy now has non-existent stats, which is kind of irrelevant. But really, the main changes here, Skaven Slaves are going to be a little worse, and the Bonebreaker is going to be cheaper, though. With no real healing support, I don't think you're going to see him very often anyway. I think you probably want to Brood Hard for this bad boy. Scrolling down to the Tomb Kings, same changes to single entities as mentioned earlier. More importantly, the Skeleton Horseman got a smidge more AP, which is nice, and Kalida's Necro Serpent now has armor, which is nifty. 110 armor means she'll be a bit beefier, a bit harder to kill off. Vampire Crow's Hulks, slightly better combat stats, and slightly more mobility. And this is one of the big ones here. All the gunnery mobs across the board, and we're just going to lump it up here, have gone down in model count to 120 models, so 90 on large. Huge nerf, I think very well deserved. They did get a buff to their missile damage, so they will be doing similar, if not equal, damage at range. They will have a little bit more HP per model, so it's not going to be a straight 25% less HP across the board, but it does mean they're going to be much easier to kill off, much easier to remove from play, and should, in my opinion, make the zombie gunnery mobs overall just much more manageable. And we're even seeing nerfs to AP damage, for example, on the bombs for the zombie bombardiers, and increased costs there. Increased reload time, stuff like that is being nerfed, and in my opinion, it's just going to make the zombie pirate gunnery mobs, which are for so long disgustingly OP, a much more manageable opponent. Depth Guard got some mild buffs, though I don't think it's going to be enough. Normal Depth Guard is okay, so I actually like these buffs. It'll make them a bit more of an efficient chaff blender. Pole arms are just in a rough spot. They're just not very good against large. I don't really know what to say. I kind of wish Depth Guard would just be rebalanced around being a 60 model unit instead of 45. Because as long as they're stuck at 45 model, I just feel they're never going to be really good. Though at least this kind of makes polearms a pseudo great weapon unit. Because their melee attack is going to be a lot better. Luther Harkon also did get a nerf to ammo. I think that he could have kept his ammo on foot. I don't know why they nerfed his foot ammo, because nobody really brings Luther on foot, and on foot he's fine. Is just abusive as all heck on a Terrorgeist. But that was a change made. I think it's a decent step in the right direction, though not full fixed. Luther's just disgusting. Carronade also got a nerf to cost, which I think is fair. All in all, definitely some fair nerfs here to the Vampire Coast. Some buffs to offset it, though. I think there could have been some better buffs for Depth Guard for sure. But by and large, I think some pretty solid reworking there, and definitely much warranted. Vampire counts, cheaper corpse cards across the field. It's nice, I guess. They'll be cheaper as mounts. They're going to be super cost efficient, so if you're not bothering with a hero, it's going to be very efficient to bring a Lord, or a character as your corpse card support. Vlad got a massive rework, as did Vargeists. They both are now AP. Vladdy Daddy now does have Terror and is more expensive, but more importantly, he's AP, and with the knockback changes, he's going to be much beefier, and he's got item changes as well, which we're going to see in a bit. So he's just overall a much stronger character. Some changes to Splash, but nothing too major. And I do believe the poor Vargeist here got left out, but both Vargeist and the Devil of Schwarzhofen, I believe, do have. There we go. There's the Vargeist. They're now all AP, which is nice. Warriors of Chaos, a slight buff to Forsaken, though certainly not huge. I think Forsaken are still going to be in a rough spot. Should help them chat clear though. Major buffs to Aspiring Champions, though keep in mind the leadership buff or Inspire Aura will be nerfed. It's going to be just +4 instead of +8 leadership now. Keep that in mind. But much harder hitting. Feral Manticore, of course, getting extra length. Chosen got a buff to damage, which is pretty significant. Chaos Warriors buffed to melee defense. Chosen with Halberds buffs to melee defense. And Marauders Grey Weapons did go down in cost, which I think is all. I think that Marauder change is fair. I think Chosen and Chaos Warriors getting buffs is insane. They're already stupidly good units. I don't think they deserve more, but CAB how it be. Sigvald now has Perfect Vigor. He also gets Slippery and Hero Killing Blow instead of Foe Seeker and Deadly Onslaught, which is really neat. Crazy good leadership. He's going to be very hard to kill, in my opinion. He's going to go from being a fairly crap Lord to being passable. He'll have his niche. Wood Elves, of course, now get Vanguard. The Glade Lord does get Vanguard when on a horse, which is neat. Slightly better leadership as well. 360 fire on an eagle, though of course the eagle is now bigger. All trees, as we've seen, Vanguard, which has been huge. It makes a massive difference. It means you can now Vanguard a slow rush on a lot of small maps, especially. It's just brutal. Durthu and all the trees Vanguard is just massive. Unicorn, of course, was improved, much like the Britonian one is much fightier. Orion now has physical resist, so he's going to be much beefier, especially once the Cloak of Isha procs. He's going to have 64% resistance to physical attacks, which is insane. It can fire while moving, and it's faster, and attacks and throws missiles faster, which is just bonkers. Treekin are a little squishier, but they now hit a lot harder, so big buff there. And of course they have Vanguard, as mentioned before. Same with Treemen. And I feel like I don't even need to explain why the fact that you can Vanguard Treekin is huge. It means you can Vanguard a roadblock for your archers. It means you can Vanguard a rush. And now they're actually decent against Chaff with Treekin, so like you're actually doing something with your Treekin too. You don't have to rely on Dryads to clear out Chaff. It's really nice. And of course Dryads are faster now, so they can overrun backlines once you win the front line. Just overall, very big changes there. Waywatchers are now less now more expensive, so that's definitely a downgrade. Scouts are a little more accurate, but nothing too huge there. I think Waywatchers will still be efficient enough to bring them every often. Some changes to units design there. Hawk Riders, of course, got 360. This is going to make them very powerful in kite builds. I think some factions will just not have any good answers to that and will suffer pretty badly, I think, from a 140 range flyer that fires 360. And then we reach abilities. So there's been some major changes here. The Realm of Souls Ushati now takes 10 seconds to proc, which is huge. The Ushati Airstrike is disgustingly OP and at the moment. And it's really the only major frustration, in my opinion, when playing against Tomb Kings, who are otherwise a well-balanced faction. So the Ushati Airstrike being a bit nerfed means you have time to decrew your artillery, bring up support, that sort of thing. I like that nerf. Menace Below, similar thing. The windup's longer. Makes it harder to get on target fast. Weapons such as the Axe of Dargo and the Git Snake and the Hellfire Sword. Weapons that needed to recharge in melee now recharge out of melee, but they recharge for longer. The duration is also longer, which I think is neat. Means that in a critical moment, they can really perform, but and you don't need to worry about staying in melee the whole time to get value. You can actually chase enemy lords and get this off cooldown eventually. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can't just have this proccing over and over and over again just by staying in melee. So I do like those changes for sure. And that just is across the board there. Witchbrew does buff units a little bit more, or I should say a lot more, because it buffs AP damage now, which is really nice for all the AP troops elves have. And of course, Wood Elf War Dancers were reworked. They now can simply switch between stances, just like Britonia Knights switch between Lance Formation and out of it. So I think that's a huge buff. Means that you can stay in your missile resist form as long as you need, your melee defense form as long as you need, that sort of thing. Especially for Spear Dancers, I think it's huge because you can close the gap with missile resist and then swap to melee, and you're good. Kazrak Scourge no longer does poison, and it no longer buffs your melee stats. Instead, it buffs your raw damage output. I actually think this is kind of a nerf because honestly, before being able to spike your melee stats up to the mid 40s, if not 50s, with Scourge meant you could be much more survivable on the Chariot. Now you're going to be much flimsier. So I actually think this is kind of a nerf. It might help offset the buffs to knockdown. Darkmail is now much, much stronger, granting a flat ward save when in combat, which is pretty bonkers. Von Karstein Ring, 66% ward save, means that Karstein's really tanky, and often he's got unlimited uses, and the duration is 22 seconds. So a common ward save on an AP Lord that got his terror. Karstein's gonna be the tank he was always meant to be, for sure. It's really, really strong. Gromby has no fear, no longer map wide, but now grants more melee defense and in a 55-meter radius, which is pretty neat. The runes all now have a casting range of 200 meters. This will make them much more flexible. It means you can actually use them to help support units anywhere in your box. It means that dwarves can now actually have longer range support for their units, where before they couldn't really use their pseudo magic with runes unless they literally blobbed up with a horde of Ironbreakers or something, which sucked. Hold the line got pricier for Empire, which sucks, but I think it's fair. Disrupted effects now all increase miscast chance by 100%, which is pretty nuts, or doubled from what they were before, which means units will now be much more likely to miscast. And then, so basically, yeah, a nice change there. Destroyer, which previously had a very long cooldown in between effects, now has a shorter cooldown of 45 seconds, so it's pretty solid there, in my opinion. Same with Tretch. So Tretch, whenever he's losing in melee, he now procs Lucky Skull, which I think is really, really nice. Moving to spells, obviously all minimum cast range was removed except for magic missiles, which is nice. Well, nice if you're the caster, not so nice if you're trying to shut them down. Transformation of Pterodon. Big nerfs, went up to 18 cost, and of course the elf version now summons an eagle, which is a downgrade from Manticore for practical purposes. Summons all cost more winds of magic now, which I think is very fair. Nerf to the Burning Head, it now does much less damage than it did before. And Penumbral Pendulum has also does much less damage now, so you can't expect them to just annihilate formations the way they did. Same with Sea Fang. So I think some good nerfs to the spells that deserved it. Would have been nice to see them buffs to a handful of spells that still suck, like Light of Battle, for example, or perhaps some of the damage spells in Lord of Heavens. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the case. Really, my main gripes here are that some units kind of... I think most of the buffs were actually very well thought out. I actually think this patch, all in all, is very reasonable. There's very few things in here that I found questionable. The biggest disappointment for me is that some units were simply overlooked, and there are some units that simply didn't get nerfs or buffs that I feel should have. All in all, I think it's a reasonable patch. Don't get me wrong, but just disappointed that Nakai didn't get a bigger buff. I'm disappointed that Questing Knights didn't get nerfed, that Peasants didn't get nerfed, that Pox Arrows didn't get nerfed. There wasn't any looking into Poison and its effects, because Poison has got a massive buff now that you can shoot it willy-nilly and not poison your own troops. It's just much more powerful than it ever was. So all in all, I think I don't have a problem with this patch, the way it's designed. But I do have a problem. I just feel there's stuff that was omitted that could have been added. There's stuff that I thought could have been reworked. But all in all, I think it's okay. And I think the changes to especially knockback should introduce an interesting period in the Warhammer meta. Do I think it's going to be good necessarily? I'm not sure. Because that's obviously the highlight of this patch. I think it's going to encourage blobbing. Footlords are not very going to be good in the majority of builds. They never will be. It's simple truth, in my opinion. Footlords do not really have a great way to be viable outside of blobs and very campy box strats, because they're just slow. And Total War Warhammer is a mobility game, so unless you completely gut mobile units and make this game infantry and monstrous infantry centric, the vast majority of factions will want mobile lords. But I do think these infantry and footlord changes should make them much more potent, and perhaps too potent in boxes. You've essentially got a mini Durthu in every infantry box now, which is a scary thought. So it'll be interesting to see how things pan out. Be sure to leave your thoughts and opinions down below, guys. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think of this incoming patch? And let me know. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.